Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Dan and Holly had once been the kind of couple that others looked up to. Their relationship began in the vibrant halls of a bustling university, where life was still full of hope and the future felt like an endless horizon. Dan had always been quiet, thoughtful, and cautious with his emotions, but Holly had burst into his life with a whirlwind of energy. She was everything he wasn't: outgoing, ambitious, and fearless. She had dreams of her own and a way of seeing the world that Dan found intoxicating.
Their love felt inevitable, like the pieces of their lives had always been meant to fit together. Friends marveled at how perfect they were for each other, how they seemed to balance each other's weaknesses with their strengths. After graduation, they got married in a small, intimate ceremony, and everyone commented on how lucky they were. They bought a home in the suburbs, white picket fence and all, and not long after, their son Liam was born. Life was a picture of domestic happiness, family trips, weekend barbecues, and quiet evenings in the backyard as they watched Liam grow.
For years, Dan thought he had everything. His job was steady, his home was filled with love, and he had a beautiful family. Holly thrived in her career, climbing the corporate ladder with ease. Dan was proud of her. They both had dreams, and though Holly's work often kept her late, it seemed a small price to pay for the life they were building together. But slowly, the small, unnoticed changes began. At first, it was just Holly's long hours at work. The project deadlines are brutal, she'd say, her voice tired yet determined. Dan didn't question it, he trusted her completely. He would take care of Liam in the evenings, making dinner, helping with homework, and tucking him into bed. Holly always seemed grateful when she came home, apologizing for the late nights with a kiss on his cheek and a quick smile before heading to bed. Yet, as the months wore on, the late nights became more frequent. Dan would lie in bed, hearing the faint vibration of her phone from the other room. When he asked about it, she waved it off. Just work, she said casually. But the tone of her voice had changed. There was a distance, an unfamiliar coldness that unsettled Dan in a way he couldn't explain. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Holly's phone buzzed again. She quickly grabbed it, swiping the screen and giving a brief glance at the message before setting it face down on the table. Dan tried to shake off the growing unease in his chest, but the questions were building. "You've been spending a lot of time at work lately," Dan said, attempting to sound casual. His voice, however, held an edge of something else, something he couldn't quite hide. Holly looked up at him, startled by the directness of his question. "Yeah, it's been a tough few months," she replied, pushing her food around her plate. "Big projects, lots of deadlines. You know how it is." Dan nodded, but he didn't know how it was. His workday ended at 5, and then he came home to his family. But Holly's didn't. He told himself it was just the nature of her job, that the stress would pass once things calmed down at work. But deep down, a seed of doubt had taken root. He began noticing things he hadn't before: the way she would pull her phone away when he got too close, how she would disappear into the other room to take certain calls, or how she avoided eye contact when he asked about her day. Late one night, Dan lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Holly slept beside him. Her phone, which she now kept on her nightstand instead of the kitchen, blinked with a new message. He knew he shouldn't look. He wasn't that kind of man. He trusted Holly, but the gnawing feeling in his gut was growing too strong to ignore. He reached over, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the phone. Holly stirred but didn't wake. Dan hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself that if he didn't find anything, he would drop it, let go of the doubt that was eating away at him. He unlocked the phone. At first, everything seemed normal: work emails, group texts with friends, messages about their son's school activities. But then, a name appeared at the top of her most recent conversations: Luke. Dan frowned. He didn't know a Luke. He opened the thread, telling himself it was probably nothing, maybe a coworker. But as he began reading, his blood ran cold. "I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. I miss you already." Dan's stomach churned as he scrolled through the messages. It was all there: every lie, every betrayal spelled out in cold, digital text. He felt sick. His hands shook as he dropped the phone back onto the nightstand, his mind racing. What the hell was this? How could she do this to him? The life they had built, the years they had spent together, raising their son, creating a future, was all of it a lie? Dan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor as the weight of the betrayal crashed down on him. He felt numb, as if everything he thought he knew had been ripped out from under him. The woman he had shared his life with, the woman he had loved, had been lying to him. For how long? Did she even love him anymore? Or had this man, this stranger, taken that from him too? The sound of Holly stirring beside him snapped him back to reality. She turned over, blinking up at him sleepily. "Dan, what's wrong?" His voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Who's Luke?" Holly froze, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment she didn't say anything, but Dan saw the truth in her face before she could even speak. It was there, written in the guilt and fear that flashed across her features. "Dan, I can explain." His voice rose, trembling with anger and hurt. "You've been lying to me. I trusted you, Holly. It's not what you think, she interrupted, sitting up now, her voice pleading. It was a mistake. I was going through a rough time, and it just happened. Dan stood up, his body shaking. A mistake? That's your excuse. How long, Holly? How long has this been going on? Holly's silence was all the answer he needed. The weight of her betrayal hit him full force, and he turned away, unable to look at her. Dan, please. It didn't mean anything. It's over. I swear it's over. But her words felt hollow, like the last desperate attempts of someone trying to salvage something that was already broken beyond repair. Dan's mind was spinning, a whirlwind of rage, hurt, and disbelief. How could this happen? How could she do this to him, to their family? I can't I can't even look at you right now, he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. I trusted you, Holly. I gave you everything. Holly was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but Dan didn't care. He couldn't care. Not anymore. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him as Holly's sobs echoed through the house. Dan stood in the hallway, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His world had just crumbled in a matter of minutes. The woman he loved, the life they had built, it was all a lie, and now he was left standing in the wreckage, unsure of what to do next. The months following Dan and Holly's divorce were a blur of pain, anger, and relentless self-doubt. Dan had always thought of himself as strong, capable of withstanding anything life threw at him, but Holly's betrayal had left him shattered in ways he never anticipated. The wound wasn't just the end of their marriage, it was the loss of trust in the very idea of love. Every day was a struggle, and every night he found himself battling the same question: how had he missed it? Dan moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the house he once shared with Holly and their son. Liam, the house was a place of too many memories, Liam's laughter filling the rooms, holidays spent decorating the tree together, late-night talks about their future. Now, all of that was gone, tainted by the knowledge that while he had been building a life with Holly, she had been tearing it apart behind his back. The divorce proceedings were brutal. The division of property, the shared custody of Liam, and the painful back and forth over what had once been their life together, it all wore Dan down. Holly had apologized repeatedly, claiming the affair was a mistake, that it was never meant to destroy their family. But for Dan, it didn't matter anymore. Trust, once broken, was impossible to rebuild. Every word she spoke felt like another lie, every apology another betrayal. For months, Dan barely functioned. His days were spent going through the motions: work, eat, sleep, repeat. His friends tried to pull him out of his shell, inviting him out for drinks, encouraging him to date again. But Dan wasn't interested. The idea of opening up to someone else, of trusting again, felt impossible. If he couldn't see Holly's betrayal coming, what was stopping it from happening again with someone else? It wasn't until he met Caroline that the cracks in his armor began to show. She appeared in his life so unexpectedly that Dan didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. They met at a friend's barbecue, one of those casual summer get-togethers where the heat is thick and the drinks are endless. Dan hadn't wanted to go. He was still wallowing in his misery, content to nurse his pain in solitude, but his best friend Eric had insisted. You can't keep doing this to yourself, Eric had said, handing Dan a beer. Holly's out of your life. You need to move on. Come on, there'll be good food. Good people. Just try. Dan reluctantly agreed, if only to shut Eric up. He showed up at the barbecue, fully expecting to make a polite appearance, and then disappear back into the comfort of his lonely apartment. But that was before Caroline. She was sitting by the pool, laughing with a group of mutual friends. Dan had noticed her immediately. Not just because of her beauty, though there was no denying that she was striking, but because of the way she seemed to light up the space around her. She had an infectious smile, the kind that drew people in, and as the evening went on, Dan found himself watching her more than he realized. It was Caroline who made the first move, walking over to Dan with a warm smile. Hey, you're Eric's friend, right, Dan? Dan blinked, surprised that she even knew his name. He nodded awkwardly. Yeah, that's me. I'm Caroline, she said, holding out her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. I've seen you at a couple of these things, but I don't think we've ever really talked. Dan smiled politely, feeling a familiar sense of detachment. He had been introduced to plenty of people since the divorce, and each time he felt the same numbness. No one really knew what he was going through. No one could understand. But Caroline was different. So, how's your summer been, she asked, her tone light but genuinely curious. Dan shrugged. Busy, I guess. Work's been keeping me occupied. Caroline nodded, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that made Dan uncomfortable. Eric mentioned you went through a pretty tough time recently. Dan tensed. He hadn't expected that. Most people skirted around the topic, unsure of how to approach the subject of his divorce. But Caroline was direct, not in a cruel way, but in a way that made Dan feel seen. Yeah, you could say that, he said after a long pause. Caroline didn't pry. She didn't offer platitudes or tell him that everything would be fine. Instead, she smiled softly. Well, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm a pretty good listener. That was it. No pressure, no awkward sympathy, just an offer to listen. Over the next few months, Dan found himself spending more and more time with Caroline. She was patient with him, never pushing too hard, never asking for more than he could give. At first, they were just friends, sharing conversations over coffee, going for walks in the park, or meeting up with friends. But as time went on, Dan realized that Caroline was becoming something more. She was nothing like Holly, where Holly had been driven and constantly focused on the next big thing. Caroline was content with the present. She had a calm, grounded energy that soothed the turmoil in Dan's mind. She made him laugh again, something he hadn't done in what felt like forever. And more importantly, she didn't judge him for the emotional baggage he carried. One night, after dinner at a quiet little restaurant, Caroline finally asked the question Dan had been dreading. "Do you ever think you'll be ready to trust someone again?" Dan looked down at his hands, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's hard to think about trusting someone after what happened with Holly." Caroline reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I get that," she said softly. "But I want you to know that I'm not her. Dan, I would never hurt you like that." Dan wanted to believe her. He really did. But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "It's not that simple," he whispered. "Holly ... she was everything to me. I thought we had something real, and then..." Caroline squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm just asking you to take a chance. With me." It was in that moment that Dan realized how much he cared about Caroline. She had been there for him, helping him pick up the pieces of his broken heart without asking for anything in return. She had given him space to heal, but now she was asking him to take a leap to trust again. And for the first time since Holly's betrayal, Dan felt like maybe he could. Their relationship deepened over the following months, and soon Dan found himself doing things he never thought he'd do again, planning for the future, talking about moving in together, and even thinking about marriage. Caroline had become his rock, the person who helped him believe that love could still exist, even after everything he had been through. She didn't push him too hard, didn't expect him to be perfect, and that was what Dan needed more than anything, someone who accepted him, flaws and all. The day Dan proposed to Caroline was quiet and understated, just like their relationship. There was no grand gesture, no elaborate plan. They were sitting on the couch one evening, watching an old movie, when Dan turned to her, his heart racing in his chest. "Marry me," he blurted out, the words escaping before he could stop them. Caroline looked at him in surprise, then smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "What?" "Marry me," Dan repeated, more certain this time. "I don't need a big wedding. I don't need anything fancy. I just ... I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Caroline laughed, wiping her eyes. "Yes, Dan, yes, of course." They married in a small, intimate ceremony, much like Dan's first wedding, but this time it felt different. With Caroline, there were no illusions of perfection. There was only the quiet understanding that love wasn't about grand gestures or promises of forever. It was about showing up every day, even when things got hard. For the first time in years, Dan felt a sense of peace. He had rebuilt his life, found someone who truly understood him, and he was ready to start a new chapter. But, as Dan would soon discover, even the most peaceful beginnings can be built on fragile foundations. Dan had believed that with Caroline he had finally found a sense of peace. Their marriage, though quieter than the passionate whirlwind he had shared with Holly, felt more solid, more rooted in reality. It was built on a foundation of mutual understanding, a shared commitment to healing from past wounds. With Caroline, Dan had learned to let go of some of the anger and resentment that had poisoned his life after Holly's betrayal. He wasn't naive enough to believe in perfect love anymore, but he thought he had found something close to it, real, dependable, and safe. But one afternoon, everything came crashing down again. It had been an ordinary day. Dan was working from home, finishing up some reports for his job, while Caroline was out running errands. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over their cozy living room. Dan could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, sounds that had become comforting in their simplicity. This was his life now, a life of quiet contentment with a woman who had helped him believe in love again. Caroline came home earlier than expected, her keys jingling in the door. Dan looked up from his laptop and smiled at her as she walked in. She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something off, something in the way she moved, in the way she avoided meeting his gaze. "Hey," she said softly, setting her purse down on the counter. "Hey," Dan replied, closing his laptop. "You're back early. Everything okay?" Caroline didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the couch and sat down heavily, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something was wrong. He could see it in her tense posture, in the way her fingers fidgeted nervously with her wedding ring. Caroline, Dan's voice was cautious now, concern lacing his words. "What's going on?" "None." She took a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on her hands. "Dan ... there's something I need to tell you." The knot in his stomach twisted harder. His mind raced, searching for explanations, but none of them prepared him for what came next. "I cheated on you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment Dan couldn't breathe. He stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend what she had just said. He must have misheard. This couldn't be happening. Not again. What? His voice was barely more than a whisper, thick with disbelief. Caroline finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. "I'm so sorry, Dan. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake." Dan felt his heart pounding in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears. A mistake. That word again. The same word Holly had used when she had torn his world apart. He stood up, his legs shaking beneath him as he tried to make sense of the words Caroline had just spoken, when his voice was cold now, detached. "When did this happen?" Caroline swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "It was a few months ago. I was going through a rough time, and I made a terrible decision. It didn't mean anything. I swear, it's over now." Dan's mind flashed back to those months. He tried to recall if there had been any signs, anything to indicate that something was wrong. But unlike with Holly, he hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Caroline had been the constant in his life, the person who grounded him. He had let his guard down, had allowed himself to believe that she would never hurt him like Holly had. And yet, here they were, living through the same nightmare all over again. Who was it? Dan's voice was tight, barely containing the fury bubbling beneath the surface. Who was it? Caroline? She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she answered. "It was someone from work. It's over, Dan, I promise. It was a mistake, and it won't happen again. Please. You have to believe me." Dan let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and foreign in the quiet room. "A mistake? You're telling me this was a mistake?" Caroline flinched, but she didn't back down. "It was. I was feeling lost, and I made the wrong choice. I regret it every day. But I love you, Dan, I love you, and I want to fix this." Dan turned away from her, his chest heaving with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. How had he ended up here again, in the exact same situation he had vowed to never find himself in? He had trusted Caroline, had believed that she was different from Holly, but now it felt like all of that had been a lie. "You promised me," Dan said quietly, his voice trembling with rage. "You promised me you'd never hurt me like this." I know. Caroline's voice cracked as she stood up, taking a step toward him. "And I'm so sorry, Dan. I never wanted this to happen, but we can get through this. We can still fix this." Dan whirled around to face her, his eyes burning with the fury he had kept buried for so long. "Fix this? How the hell do we fix this, Caroline? You cheated on me. You lied to me. You destroyed everything we had." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes, but Dan couldn't feel anything but the cold, sharp sting of betrayal. He had been here before, in this exact place, listening to the same empty promises and apologies. He had believed in forgiveness once, had given Holly the benefit of the doubt, and look where that had gotten him. Was he supposed to go through all of that again? "Please, Dan," Caroline whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if I have to. But don't throw away everything we've built."
Dan's head was spinning, his thoughts a chaotic mess of anger and disbelief. He had worked so hard to move on from Holly's betrayal, to rebuild his life, to trust again, and now it felt like all of that had been for nothing.
"You don't get it," Dan said bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't understand what this feels like to have your heart ripped out like this. You have no idea what it's like to be betrayed by the one person you thought you could trust more than anyone." Caroline took another step toward him, her voice desperate. "I do understand, Dan, I understand, because I know how much I've hurt you, and it's killing me. I hate myself for what I did. But please. Don't walk away from us. We can get through this. I love you." Dan stared at her, his mind reeling. Could they get through this? Could he ever truly forgive her, knowing that she had done the very thing he feared most? His heart felt like it was being torn in two. A part of him wanted to believe her, to hold on to the life they had built together, to trust that they could find a way forward. But another part of him, the part that had been broken by Holly, the part that still bore the scars of that betrayal, told him that trusting again would only lead to more pain. He took a step back, putting distance between them. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Caroline's face crumpled, her tears falling freely now. "Please, Dan, don't give up on us." Dan didn't answer. He turned away from her, his mind a swirling storm of confusion and heartache. He needed space, needed time to think, to process everything that had just been ripped open. Without another word, Dan grabbed his jacket and walked out the front door, leaving Caroline standing alone in the living room, her sobs echoing in the silence. The days following Caroline's confession were a blur of silence and distance. Dan felt hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. He moved through his days mechanically, avoiding Caroline whenever possible, retreating to the spare bedroom at night. It was as though they were strangers living in the same house, and the weight of her betrayal pressed down on him like a constant, unbearable presence. Caroline tried to reach out, tried to talk to him, but Dan couldn't stand the sight of her, the sound of her voice. Every time he looked at her, he saw Holly. Every time he heard her apologize, it was like reliving the past, the lies, the deception, the heartbreak. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let this happen again, that he would never be that vulnerable with someone again. Yet here he was, once more destroyed by the one person he thought he could trust. One evening, after several days of unbearable tension, Caroline finally cornered him in the kitchen. Dan had been making himself a cup of tea, staring blankly out the window, lost in thought. He didn't hear her come in until she spoke. "Dan, we need to talk." Her voice was soft, hesitant, but there was a determination beneath it that Dan hadn't heard before. He stiffened but didn't turn to face her. He wasn't sure he could. The very sight of her brought a wave of emotions he couldn't control: anger, sorrow, betrayal, confusion. All of it blended together into a mess that left him feeling sick. "There's nothing left to talk about," Dan muttered, his voice low and cold. Caroline stepped closer, her presence now unavoidable. "Yes, there is. We can't keep doing this. We can't just pretend like it never happened and live in silence. We have to talk about it." Dan finally turned, setting his cup down on the counter with a sharp clink. His eyes met hers, and for a moment he saw the woman he had loved, his wife, his partner. But the image shattered as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold reality of what she had done. "What do you want me to say, Caroline?" His voice was strained, heavy with exhaustion. "That I forgive you. That everything's going to be okay, because it's not." Caroline's eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "I know it's not okay. I know I hurt you in a way that I can never fully make up for. But if there's any chance at all that we can fix this, we have to try. I need you to try." Dan laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet kitchen. "You need me to try? After everything you've done?" Caroline wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Yes, because I know you. Dan, I know you can't move on from this unless you let go of what's still holding you back." Dan narrowed his eyes, unsure of what she meant. "What the hell are you talking about?" Caroline took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. "Holly?" At the mention of his ex-wife's name, Dan's whole body tensed. He hadn't spoken about Holly in months, hadn't thought about her in any real way since Caroline came into his life. Holly was his past, a painful memory that he had done everything to bury. The idea that Caroline would bring her up now, in the middle of their own crisis, felt like a cruel twist of fate. "What does Holly have to do with this?" Dan asked, his voice hard. "Everything," Caroline said softly. "You never forgave her. Dan, you've been carrying that anger with you all this time. It's been poisoning you, and it's poisoning us. You still blame her for everything, and it's keeping you from moving forward." Dan shook his head, refusing to believe what he was hearing. "This isn't about Holly, this is about you and what you did." "I know," Caroline admitted, her voice breaking slightly, "but part of the reason you can't forgive me is because you never forgave her. That betrayal still haunts you, Dan, I can see it. And if there's any chance for us to fix this, you need to let it go." Dan's chest tightened, anger flaring up inside him. "You think I'm still holding on to Holly? That's ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous," Caroline countered, her eyes fierce. "It's the truth. You never got closure with her. You never let yourself heal from what she did to you. And now, you're punishing me for it." Dan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Was she right? Had Holly's betrayal tainted his ability to move forward, even with Caroline? He thought he had left all of that behind, but now, as he stood there, he realized that Holly's ghost still lingered. The pain of what she had done had never truly left him. "What are you asking me to do?" Dan asked finally, his voice quieter now, but still laced with frustration. Caroline looked at him with an intensity that startled him. "I need you to meet with her. To sit down with Holly and talk to her. Get the closure you never got. Confront her, forgive her, whatever it is you need to do to let go of the past." Dan stared at her in disbelief. "You want me to meet with Holly? After all these years?" "Yes," Caroline said firmly. "Because if you don't, you'll never be free of her, and we'll never be able to heal. You'll always see me through the lens of what she did to you." Dan turned away, running his hands through his hair in frustration. The very idea of sitting down with Holly, of dredging up all the old pain, made him sick to his stomach. But deep down, he knew Caroline wasn't wrong. The anger he felt toward Holly had never truly gone away. It had festered, lingering in the corners of his heart, affecting every relationship that followed. "Why are you doing this?" Dan asked, his voice rough of emotion. "Why are you pushing me to go back to her?" "Because I love you," Caroline whispered, stepping closer. "And because I know you'll never be able to love me fully until you make peace with her." Dan stood there in silence, his mind spinning. He had no idea if he could do what Caroline was asking. The thought of seeing Holly again, of looking into the eyes of the woman who had broken him so completely, was terrifying. But what choice did he have? If he didn't do this, if he didn't confront his past, then his future with Caroline or anyone else would always be haunted by what had happened. He finally turned to face Caroline, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision before him. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll meet with her." Caroline's eyes filled with relief, but she said nothing. She simply nodded, knowing that this was just the first step. There was no guarantee that meeting with Holly would fix things, no promise that forgiveness would come easily. But for the first time in days, Dan felt a flicker of hope, however small, that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to let go of the past that had defined him for so long. The next morning, Dan sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. Holly's number was still saved in his contacts, even though he hadn't dialed it in years. His thumb hovered over the call button, his stomach twisting with anxiety. He had no idea what he was going to say to her, how he was going to start this conversation after so much time had passed. But he knew he had to do it.
With a deep breath, Dan pressed the button and listened to the ringing on the other end, each tone making his heart pound faster. After what felt like an eternity, Holly answered.
Hello. Her voice was exactly the same. And for a moment, Dan was thrown back to all the memories they had shared, both the good and the terrible. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. Holly, he said, his throat tight. It's Dan. There was a brief pause on the other end, and Dan could almost feel her surprise through the phone. Dan ... Wow. I didn't expect to hear from you. I didn't expect to call, Dan admitted. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. But ... I think we need to talk. Another pause. Okay, Holly said cautiously. About what? About us, Dan said, his voice firmer now. About everything. Holly was quiet for a moment before she finally answered. All right. When do you want to meet? Dan stared out the window, his mind a whirl of emotions. Tomorrow. There's a cafe near my place. Can you meet me there at noon? I'll be there, Holly said softly, before the call ended. Dan set the phone down, feeling a strange mixture of dread and relief. The hardest part was yet to come, but at least he had taken the first step. He didn't know what would come of it, didn't know if this meeting would bring the closure Caroline believed he needed, but it was time to face the past, once and for all. Dan sat in the cafe, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, eyes unfocused as he stared out the window. His mind was miles away, caught between the present and the past. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as he waited, the bustling sounds of the cafe blending into a dull hum in the background. Every so often he glanced at the door, half expecting to see her walk in at a moment, his heart twisting each time the bell over the door jingled. He hadn't seen Holly in years, not since the divorce papers were signed, not since they divided up their lives and gone their separate ways. For a long time he hadn't allowed himself to think about her, about the life they had shared, and how it had all fallen apart. He had told himself he was done with that chapter, that it was over and buried. But now, as he waited for her, all of the old memories came flooding back, the good, the bad, and the ones that still hurt too much to remember. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. He turned his head and saw her, Holly, standing just inside the cafe, scanning the room until her eyes landed on him. Time had passed, but she looked almost the same. Her auburn hair was shorter now, styled in a way that made her look more mature, and her face had a few more lines, but she still carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had once drawn him to her. Dan's stomach nodded as she walked over, a hesitant smile on her face. Hey, she said softly, standing at the edge of the table. Hey, Dan replied, his voice tight. Holly slid into the seat across from him, her hands folded on the table, fingers nervously fidgeting with her wedding ring. No, Dan realized, not a wedding ring anymore. She wasn't married, not to him, not to anyone, as far as he knew. The reminder of how much had changed between them hit him like a punch to the chest. There was an awkward silence as they both avoided eye contact, each of them unsure of how to start. Dan wasn't even sure why he had agreed to this, why Caroline had pushed him to do this. What could it possibly change? But now that Holly was here, sitting across from him, he knew there was no turning back. I wasn't sure you'd actually call, Holly said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was an underlying tension in her words. She had to be just as nervous as he was, though she was better at hiding it. Dan shrugged, staring down at his cup. I wasn't sure I would either. Another pause. What do you want to talk about? Holly asked cautiously, her voice tinged with uncertainty. It's been a long time. Dan lifted his eyes to meet hers, the memories rushing back faster now. He had once loved this woman with everything he had given her his heart, his trust, his life, and she had destroyed all of it. But now, sitting here, looking at her after all these years, he didn't feel the same anger he had carried for so long. What he felt was something else, something deeper, heavier, but less sharp. It was more like a dull ache, the kind that settles into your bones and never fully goes away. I don't really know where to start, Dan admitted. He ran his hand through his hair, letting out a heavy sigh. I guess I just ... I need to understand. Holly frowned slightly. Understand what? Why? Dan said simply. His voice cracked, the weight of the question too much to contain in that one word. Why did you do it, Holly? Why did you cheat on me? Holly's eyes flickered with a mixture of regret and something else, something that looked like exhaustion, like she had been carrying the burden of that question for years. She looked away for a moment, biting her lip, before finally answering. I don't know if there's an answer that will satisfy you, Dan, she said quietly, or even one that will make sense. But ... I'll try. Dan nodded, waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never asked her this question directly, not during the divorce, not in the years after. He had been too angry, too broken, to care about her reasons back then. But now, he needed to know. He needed to hear it. Holly took a deep breath. I think ... at some point, I just got lost. I don't know when it happened, but I stopped feeling like the person I was when we first got married. I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt like I was living someone else's life. And Luke HE made me feel seen again. I know that's not an excuse. It's just what happened. Dan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the cup. So it wasn't me. I wasn't enough. Holly shook her head quickly, her eyes filled with regret. No, Dan, it wasn't about you. You were a good husband, a great father. It was never about you not being enough. It was about me feeling like I wasn't enough, like I was disappearing. Dan's heart tightened at her words. Part of him had always wondered if it had been his fault, if there was something he had done or not done that had pushed her away. Hearing her say that it wasn't about him should have brought relief, but instead, it just left him feeling hollow. You didn't even give us a chance, Dan muttered, his voice trembling with the emotion he had tried so hard to bury. You threw it all away before we could even try to fix things? I know, Holly whispered, her voice breaking, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. Dan, I wish I could take it back, but I can't. All I can do is apologize, even if it doesn't mean anything now. Dan stared at her, his chest tight with the weight of her words. He had imagined this conversation in so many different ways over the years, imagined himself raging at her, screaming about how she had ruined everything. But now, sitting here, hearing her speak, he just felt tired. So tired of carrying the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. I spent years hating you, Dan said softly, his voice low and raw. Years thinking about how you destroyed our life. How you broke me in ways I didn't think I could ever recover from. Holly's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. I know. But sitting here now, Dan continued, I don't think I have it in me to hate you anymore. Holly blinked, her breath catching in her throat. You don't. Dan shook his head, the words coming out slowly, as if they had been buried deep inside him for too long. No, I've held on to that anger for so long, and it's only hurt me. You moved on, but I was stuck. Stuck in that pain and the betrayal, and it's affected everything I've done since. Every relationship I've tried to have, but I don't want to be stuck anymore. Holly's lips trembled, and she wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. I'm so sorry, Dan, for everything. I wish I had been braver. I wish I had fought for us instead of running away. Dan nodded, his throat tight. I wish that too. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared past heavy between them. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. But for the first time in years, Dan felt a strange sense of peace begin to settle over him. The hurt was still there, but the rage had begun to dissolve, replaced by something softer: acceptance. I forgive you, Holly, Dan said, his voice barely a whisper. Holly let out a shaky breath, her eyes closing for a brief moment, as if the words had released her from a prison she had been locked in for years. When she opened them again, her gaze was filled with gratitude and sadness. Thank you. Dan nodded, feeling the tension in his chest begin to ease. He had spent so long chasing after answers, after some kind of resolution. But now, he realized that closure wasn't something Holly could give him. It was something he had to give himself. I think this is the last time we need to see each other, Dan said gently, offering her a small, sad smile. Holly nodded, understanding. Yeah, I think so too. They exchanged a few more quiet words, but the conversation had come to its natural end. The past had been laid bare, and now there was nothing left to say. They both stood, and for a brief moment, Dan considered hugging her, but he knew that part of their lives was over. As Holly walked out of the cafe, Dan sat back down, exhaling deeply. The weight that had been pressing on him for so long was finally beginning to lift. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter now, more bearable. For the first time in years, Dan felt like he could breathe again. The walk back from the cafe was filled with a strange, eerie calm. Dan had expected to feel something more after his meeting with Holly, maybe closure, maybe relief, maybe even a resurgence of old anger. Instead, he felt hollow, like he had just closed the door on a chapter of his life that had been haunting him for so long. It wasn't the sense of triumph he had hoped for, but more of a quiet resignation. He had finally confronted the ghost of his past, and it had dissolved into nothingness. When he returned home, Caroline was waiting for him. She sat on the couch, her hands nervously clasped in her lap, her eyes flickering toward the door every few seconds. As soon as Dan walked in, she stood up, her face a mixture of hope and apprehension. How did it go? She asked quietly, her voice tentative, as though she feared the answer. Dan paused by the doorway, taking a moment to look at her. Caroline had been the person who helped him pick up the pieces after Holly, the person who had been there when he thought he would never trust again. But now, as he stood there, a strange feeling swept over him, a sense of detachment that he hadn't expected. His emotions toward her, once so vibrant and real, felt distant, dulled by everything that had happened. It went ... Okay, Dan said slowly, his voice neutral. Caroline's eyes searched his face, trying to read his expression. And, did it help? Dan sighed, walking over to the couch but not sitting down. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to gather his thoughts. I don't know. I guess, in a way, it did. I confronted her, and we talked about everything. I even forgave her. Caroline's face lit up slightly at his words, but Dan could see the caution in her eyes. That's good, right? It's what you needed. You can finally let go of all that anger now. Maybe Dan murmured, but even as he said it, he wasn't sure if that was true. The anger toward Holly had been a huge part of him for so long that letting it go felt like losing a piece of his identity. He was free of it now, but the freedom wasn't the relief he had imagined. It left him feeling empty, and in that emptiness, other truths were beginning to rise to the surface. Caroline stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Now we can focus on us. Dan, we can start over, rebuild what we had." Dan looked down at her hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of her touch. Once, that touch would have soothed him, reminded him of the comfort and love they shared. But now, it felt like a reminder of something else, of the distance that had grown between them, of the betrayal she had confessed to just days before. "Can we?" Dan asked quietly, his voice filled with doubt. Caroline blinked, pulling her hand back slightly, confusion and fear flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "We can get through this, Dan. We've been through worse, haven't we?" Dan shook his head slowly, the weight of everything finally crashing down on him. "I don't think we have. I don't think we've been through anything worse than this." Caroline stared at him, her face paling. "Dan, please. I know I made a mistake, but I'm trying to make things right. I love you. I want us to work." Dan's heart ached at her words, but there was no escaping the truth anymore. He had spent so much time avoiding it, convincing himself that they could move past her betrayal, that he could forgive her the same way he had tried to forgive Holly, but something inside him had changed, and he couldn't deny it any longer. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Caroline, Dan said softly, his voice heavy with sadness. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that things can go back to the way they were." Caroline's face crumpled, and she took a step closer to him, her voice trembling. "Don't say that, Dan. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through it together. I'll do anything, just please don't give up on us." Dan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could fix things, but deep down he knew the truth. His love for Caroline had changed. It had withered under the weight of her betrayal, and now it felt like something that had been lost forever. "It's not just about what you did," Dan said, opening his eyes to look at her. "It's about everything. Holly, the betrayal, the trust I lost back then, it never fully came back. And now, after you," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't think I can trust again. Not like I used to, and I don't think that's fair to either of us." Caroline's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she pleaded with him. "But I love you, Dan. Doesn't that count for something? Can't we try?" Dan's heart twisted painfully at the sight of her tears, but he knew that staying together out of guilt or obligation wasn't the answer. He had done that with Holly, had tried to forgive and move on, and it had only led to more heartbreak. He couldn't make the same mistake again. "I love you too," Caroline, Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's not enough. Not anymore." Caroline shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, please. Don't say that. We can still fix this. We have to." Dan stepped back, putting more distance between them, his chest tightening with every word. "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't stay. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." Caroline sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand as her shoulders shook. Dan's heart shattered at the sight of her breaking down, but he knew that this was the only way forward for both of them. "I'm sorry," Dan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I really am." Caroline looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "So that's it? After everything we've been through, you're just going to walk away?" Dan swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of his decision. "I don't see any other way." Caroline's face twisted with grief, but underneath the sorrow, there was a flicker of something else, anger. "You're doing the same thing Holly did to you," she spat, her voice laced with bitterness. "You're giving up without even trying." Dan flinched at her words, but he didn't respond. He had nothing left to give. He couldn't explain to her that this wasn't about revenge or payback, that this wasn't about Holly anymore. It was about him, about what he needed to heal, and that healing meant letting go. "I'll always care about you," Dan said quietly, turning to leave. "But I can't do this anymore." He walked toward the door, his heart heavy with the weight of the life he was leaving behind. As he opened the door, Caroline's voice echoed through the room, filled with pain and desperation. "Dan, please." But he couldn't turn back. Not this time. The door closed behind him, and Dan stood outside, the cold evening air wrapping around him like a shroud. He felt the sting of the wind on his face, but it couldn't compare to the ache in his chest. He had made his choice, and now, there was no going back. As he walked down the street, Dan felt a strange sense of finality. His marriage to Holly, his relationship with Caroline, it was all over now. The future stretched before him, uncertain and empty, but it was his to shape. For the first time in years, Dan felt like he was free from the pain of the past, free from the betrayals that had haunted him, free to finally start over. But with that freedom came the terrifying realization that he had no idea where to go next. All he knew was that he was done living in the shadows of broken trust. Now, he had to learn how to live for himself.